Soviet enemy should cross the river and break through to threaten the German capital, they were to be stopped and crushed at the gates of Berlin itself. On its perimeter, the city was guarded by its own fortified defense line. Inside were yet more lines, dividing the capital into independent self-defending sectors, many crisscrossed by waterways. Berlin's massive concrete flak towers were also formidable. Their guns could be trained to fire down into the streets. The will to fight was, the Nazi leadership believed, the key to survival for the shattered remnants of the Third Reich. The population, military and civilian, must be made to believe that in defeat they would be given no quarter. For most, there was little difficulty imagining the fate that would befall them at the hands of vengeful Russians. But the West, too, had added fuel to the fire of German resolve. Almost ceaseless bombing of the Reich cities had already left many in ruins, and in the summer of 1944, an Allied plan had been discussed which seemed to promise no mercy for the German people. Germany was to be divided permanently. Huge swathes of territory were to be given to the Soviet Union, Poland, France, and Denmark. All her surviving heavy industry was to be dismantled, and Germany was to be returned to a medieval state of small farmers and a subsistence economy. The plan was supported by Roosevelt, but strongly opposed by Churchill, and was soon dropped. However, for Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, it was priceless material. To the citizens of the Reich, and especially to the inhabitants of its capital, who had suffered so much from Allied bombing, it was yet more proof that the only hope was determined resistance to the very end. By 1944, Marshal Georgy Zhukov had already proved himself the greatest and most aggressive commander in the Red Army. Zhukov was Stalin's favorite general and a popular military hero. He was brilliant, ruthless, and had never once been defeated in battle. Zhukov had successfully defended Leningrad, and at the Battle of Stalingrad had encircled and captured the entire German Sixth Army. Zhukov had also played an important part in the great Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk. Since August 1942, Zhukov had been Deputy Supreme Commander of all Soviet forces, second only to Stalin. He had directed the huge Russian drive across the Ukraine, and as commander of the First Ukrainian Front, had advanced at an astonishing 30 miles a day in early 1944. In June, he took overall command of the Red Army fronts and orchestrated Russia's greatest military achievement of the war so far, the Bagration offensive and the rout of the German Army Group Center. Zhukov's very success now threatened to make him an object of suspicion to Stalin, a situation usually attended with fatal consequences. However, as the finest commander in the history of the Red Army, even the Soviet dictator could not afford to move against him, and in November 1944, Stalin let it be understood that Zhukov's forces should be the ones to attack and capture the Nazi capital. Only on the eve of the attack would Zhukov learn that with Stalin, nothing was certain. Although Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner was an able soldier, he was also one of the most fervent Nazis ever to command a German army. Schörner would follow Hitler's most unrealistic orders to the letter, often with disastrous results. Schörner had been made chief of the National Socialist Leadership Corps in early 1944, and in June was in command of Army Group North during the Soviet summer offensive. With his army, Schörner was trapped on the Courland Peninsula, helpless for 6 months, until in January 1945, he was evacuated to command Army Group Center. During the final Russian attack, far from reflecting the truth of the desperate predicament in which his forces found themselves, Schörner constantly fed Hitler's delusions with promises of victory. On the eve of the last battle, Schörner would be rewarded for his slavishness. Hitler would make him a field marshal and the last commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht. During 1944, the Red Army had launched no fewer than 10 major offensives, and as the year had gone on, its performance in the field had improved beyond all recognition. The Russian ability to conduct massive battles of encirclement at speed now equaled or even surpassed the expertise of the German army at the height of its powers early in the war. The Red Air Force had also evolved into a supremely proficient service, excelling particularly in tactical operations. Its effectiveness had been radically improved by decentralizing its command structure, so that Soviet air power could respond quickly and flexibly to requests for support from the ground forces. By now, all arms of the Soviet military machine were lavishly equipped with advanced weapons. Russian industrial production, free from the disruptive effects of enemy bombing and able to call on vast reserves of labor and strategic materials, could easily replace the Red Army's losses. At the start of 1945, the strength of Soviet forces in the field was over 6 million men, 15,000 combat aircraft, 100,000 artillery pieces, and 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. In 1943, the T-34, once the finest tank on the battlefield, began to lose its edge against greatly improved German tank designs. In particular, the T-34's 76mm gun was no longer effective against the heavy armor of the latest Panzers. The answer was to upgun the T-34 to an 85mm weapon. The new gun demanded a new turret, and the resulting design was an efficient 3-man unit. Crew capacity went up from 4 to 5, meaning that the tank commander could concentrate on tactics and leave the gunnery to a specialist. Additional improvements included a new 5-speed gearbox and increased armor thickness to 110mm on the front and 90mm on the turret. The new tank was a formidable weapon. Together with its parent, the T-34-76, the 85 would play a central role in the coming Soviet offensive. Introduced in February 1944, the Stalin II had been designed to counter the formidable German Panthers and Tigers. Although by German standards a medium tank, the Stalin was very heavily armored and mounted an enormous 122mm gun. In its ability to penetrate armor at medium ranges, the Stalin's gun was in fact little better than the German 75 or 88, and the tank could carry far less ammunition, only 28 rounds. However, when firing high explosive shells against soft targets, the Stalin was extremely effective. In the Berlin street fighting, the Stalin would prove itself all but indestructible. The Ilyushin-II Sturmovik ground attack aircraft was first introduced in mid-1941 and would go on in single and two-seat versions to become the most numerous aircraft in the Red Air Force and in the history of aviation. Believed by Joseph Stalin to be the single most important weapon possessed by the Soviet Union, the Sturmovik came to symbolize the resurgence of Russian power after the setbacks of 1941. The Sturmovik's capabilities in the ground attack role were due, above all, to its heavy armor protection. It had a continuous backbone of 7mm armor plate that protected the cockpit, radiators, engine, and fuel tanks. The Sturmovik could survive anti-aircraft barrages lethal to any other warplane. The Sturmovik's engine delivered its maximum power at low altitudes. Armed with rockets, bombs, cannon, and machine guns, the Sturmovik would play a leading part in the destruction of German armor and lines of communication throughout the final offensive. The Katyusha, or Little Kate, multiple rocket launcher, had been developed in the late 1930s and was first used in action in July 1941. Because of the peculiar sound it made on launching, the weapon was named Stalin's organ by German troops. By 1945, the Katyusha fired 132mm fin-stabilized rockets with 40-pound high-explosive warheads to a distance of 9,250 yards. The weapons could be mounted on 2.5-ton trucks, which had their cabs protected by steel blast deflectors, or in freestanding launchers, able to fire up to 48 rockets in a volley. To the German infantrymen, the Katyusha was the most feared weapon in the Soviet arsenal, and although the rockets were none too accurate, a Katyusha barrage could lay waste a vast area of the battlefield, destroying everything in its path. Since the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army had changed out of all recognition. Stalin had moved to curb the power of the detested political commissars, and a new generation of competent and dedicated officers and NCOs had risen on their merits to displace party loyalists. As for the private soldier, even the German enemy had been forced to recognize that the men of the Red Army were not only courageous in battle, but also well-trained and extremely tough. Many infantrymen had walked the 1,000 miles from Stalingrad to the Vistula, while home leave was practically unheard of. For Red Army soldier, discipline was harsh and unrelenting. Stalin had said that it took a brave man to be a coward in the Red Army, and tens of thousands had been shot for desertion at Stalingrad alone.